I've been playing fantasy for a long time, and I was really, really bad at it for, I'd say, like 7 or 8 years. I was just like, I could never get out of sixth place. And about this, maybe a little bit later than this, last year, I quit my job. I was a stay-at-home dad. I had a newborn baby boy, so I was home with the kid, and I was doing a career transition into data analytics. And then as a part of one of the courses that I took, I was doing like a little project at the end of it to try to use some of those skills. And I was like, I got to get better at fantasy hockey, so let me try this. And then on top of that, the guy that's in my league, he just pissed me off. He did like a whole banner raising ceremony for his league win last year and all this stuff. I'm like, I got to beat this guy this year. This is not going to happen again.
You're now listening to the Boys in the Booth podcast with your hosts, Harper Cody, Chad Melbourne, and Casey Abrams.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah!
Good evening and welcome to episode 159 of the Boys in the Booth podcast. Just Cody and Melbourne with you for this one. Abrams not available for this one, but Chad, we've got a very special guest joining us. And so before you introduce him on here, how you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm looking forward actually to reading week next week. It's been, I feel like, an absolute grind to start the new year in law school, like shocker. But now I'm, waiting for reading week just to get a little bit of a break and relax. And I actually think I'm going to come visit in Brockville for a few days. So
Sweet.
Looking forward to that as well. But yeah, you mentioned it. We have a guest this episode, and I'm super excited to introduce him. It's Kenny from Data Draft Hockey on YouTube and Instagram and all of the socials out there. And the reason I wanted to bring Ken on was because I stumbled across his page on YouTube. And what he does on YouTube is all things fantasy hockey, using advanced analytics to help you improve as a fantasy hockey manager, and improve I have. That's what I've done. I'm currently sitting in first in one of my leagues and second in the Boys in the Booth League, and it's all thanks to Kenny. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our special guest, Ken from Data Draft. How you doing?
Good. What's going on, guys? How you doing?
Oh, fantastic. Ken, I wanted to ask, just to start off, how'd you get into the whole YouTube game? Like, where does the passion come from for fantasy hockey? All of that.
I've been playing fantasy for a long time, and I was really, really bad at it for, I'd say, like 7 or 8 years. I was just like, I could never get out of sixth place. And about this, maybe a little bit later than this, last year, I quit my job. I was a stay-at-home dad. I had a newborn baby boy, so I was home with the kid, and I was doing a career transition into data analytics. And then as a part of one of the courses that I took, I was doing like a little project at the end of it to try to use some of those skills. And I was like, I got to get better at fantasy hockey, so let me try this. And then on top of that, the guy that's in my league, he just pissed me off. He did like a whole banner raising ceremony for his league win last year and all this stuff. I'm like, I got to beat this guy this year. This is not going to happen again. So I started the YouTube channel just to try to like practice some of the data skills and whatnot. And I really enjoyed it. And it was helping, a lot of people make better decisions going into the draft. And that was a big part of what I'm trying to get across to the audience is like 70% of the work is in the draft, and then you kind of have to manage from there. But the draft is really important. You can make or break your season with the draft. So the first couple of videos were just like draft strategy tips and trying to just go over some of the things that people make mistakes on. And even some of the bigger like fantasy channels out there, they make a lot of mistakes just in terms of like roster construction. So I wanted to go through what happened in my league and like some of the tips and tricks that I've used, and then show how certain things work out, whether you do no goalie strategy or pick a goalie first or whatever. There's a lot of stuff that went into like just looking back at my own league and trying to help tweak so that we can find a better draft strategy together and then move forward. And then it's just kind of built from there.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And like the reason, and I'm actually super glad that you brought up the draft, by the way, because the reason I stumbled across your account was because I find that there's a ton of resources out there for helping you with the draft in fantasy hockey. And me, for example, I use a bunch of different mostly free advanced analytics sites. Money Puck is a great go-to. Dauber Sports for everything is great. But I find after the draft, there's not a lot of content and not a lot of resources out there to kind of help you on a weekly basis. So that is why I stumbled across your account and found it super helpful. So I'm glad that you really focused on that. And I was wondering then, focusing on your sort of weekly videos and weekly pickups and things like that, what are some of the key areas that you think, typical fantasy managers should be aware of when it comes to weekly moves? Like, what are some things that are on the top of your mind as someone who makes fantasy content on a weekly basis?
Well, one of the mistakes that I see is that, and anybody out there, there's a lot of like big name YouTubers and fantasy players out there that they're just looking at hot streaks, and like they're just going to look at this guy's done this over the last stretch or whatever. And you can do things that way. There's definitely like value in riding a hot streak, especially if nothing's changed. So for example, right now, Philip Hedl is on a massive hot streak, but he's playing with that kid line. So that's going to continue. As long as they keep that line together, that can continue, but not every hot streak is the same. So what I was trying to do is two things. Basically, one, you should, after your draft, you should leave 1 or 2 spots on your roster for weekly streams, just so that you have some flexibility to manage the schedule. Sometimes your star players are only going to be playing twice in a week, so you need to kind of account for that with your weekly waiver ads. So when you think about picking guys up, it's usually for me about roster maximization. So finding guys that are playing on the light nights that you can then add to your roster, because on the heavy nights, you have to make some decisions as to what, who's going to get in your lineup and whatnot. So for me, I like to, especially in the weekly videos, just highlight the players that are playing on the off nights, and then look at some players that are trending in the right direction on some hot streaks. But I did a feature for a couple months, and it got to be repetitive because it was like the names weren't changing. But I was also looking at goals above it and below expected. So you'd look at the goals below expected and see who's getting chances but not cashing in yet, and then some of those guys would break out and start to score. That happened with Matt Barzell not too long ago. And I think it was December. He was getting a ton of chances and he had like no goals on the season. He finally broke out a little bit. But basically just roster maximization, and then trying to, if you're in a categories league and you're light on hits or blocks or whatever, I try to highlight guys that'll fill that specific role. If you're in a league without hits and blocks, but you need power play goals or something, sometimes I try to, filter in some advice that's tailored towards points leagues that have waiting for goals and power play points and things like that. But really, I mean, the number one thing to keep in mind, and it's difficult as a fantasy YouTuber because everybody plays in a different league format. So I have a couple different leagues I'm in, points leagues, category leagues, but people come and ask me, this player or that player, and it's like, well, I need to know what kind of league format you're in, how many teams, that kind of thing. And that could make or break, do I pick up, Carter Verhaeghe right now? Well, yeah, he's hot, but, if you're not getting extra waiting for shots or goals or whatever, it may not be the best pickup. So just try to, maximize your roster with the off nights, look for hot streaks and cold streaks, and then, just trying to maximize your fantasy format and use that to your advantage.
Yeah, that's great. All of that very, very relevant, and games played, I think, are truly king. So I'm glad that you highlight, who's playing on the off nights, who's on hot streaks on those teams, who's still available. I know you do your percentage owned when you talk about players, so that's always helpful to have in the back of your mind too. And while we're talking about roster construction out of the draft as well, I wanted to ask your opinion on taking goaltenders high in the draft, because that was something that Harper did this year in the first round. He took Andrei Vasilevsky 7th overall, and that was something that raised some eyebrows. So what are your thoughts on taking goalies high, Ken?
Can't do it. You can't take a goalie in the first 2 rounds. And I that was the first video on my channel. I actually got this tip from it was NHL Radio on The Point with Boomer Gordon, and I was listening to him. He has a fantasy show on Fridays at 2. It's a really great resource, and he was basically just kind of harping on that tone of like, just don't pick a goalie in the first round. And I'm like, why? So I looked into it, and basically in the last 5 years of my league, everybody who's picked a goalie high has finished in the bottom 6 out of 12, or bottom half out of 10 or whatever. And it just basically comes down to, there's guys especially as the scoring increases and there's more and more players that are over 100-point pace or well over a point per game pace. Those guys at the top of the draft who put up a ton of points, they're very consistent. They typically, like Huberdeau this year is one of the only examples of a guy who's a very high pick who's just like he doesn't have it this year. Typically, everybody who's picked in the top 2 rounds that's a forward or a defenseman will have at least some level of a good season. And then, most of the time, if you're picking McDavid, Draisaitl, you're getting excellent performance. But with goaltending, typically every year there's a goalie that comes out of nowhere and ends up, in the Vezina conversation. This year it's Allmark. Vanecek's one of those guys that I never saw coming, and he's just taken off. And you can usually find those guys on the wire. You can find them deep in drafts. Obviously, Allmark, probably not a wire guy, but Vanecek had hit the wire in some leagues. So you can usually find a starting goalie that becomes elite deeper in the draft, but you will never find a 1.5 point per game offensive player that deep in the draft. So that's why if the guy in my league had Shesterkin 7th, and he started out really well. He was in the first place for a couple weeks, and now he's in 7th, and he's falling back out of the playoffs because he just doesn't have the offense to power him forward, especially in a category league where you have 6 offensive categories and then 4 goaltending categories. So it's a little bit different if you're in a points league and you get, special weighting for wins, shutouts, and that kind of thing, total saves. That might change the equation a little bit, but in general, you're not going to get access to those elite, like 1.5 point per game guys anywhere else in the draft, and you can get goaltenders later in the draft.
Yeah, so missing out on the top tier production players by taking a goalie high, and just the fact that goalies are wildly inconsistent, save for a few in the NHL. I would say Shesterkin, Vasilevsky.
Those guys have been good. They're just not the number one guy in fantasy, and it's very difficult for that guy to be picked at the top and then stay there the entire year and not dip at all. Like that's part of the whole thought process too.
Right, and games played too is another factor, because even if you're Andrei Vasilevsky or Igor Shesterkin, you're not going to play all 82 games, whereas Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid, if they're healthy, they are going to play those games. So Harper, all of that being said, do you have any pushback? Any you want to defend your pick or what?
Well, it's hilarious that immediately as that got brought up, I knew that was directed at me. You're just shaking your head right off the bat with that. But, I was kind of kicking myself after, because realizing that fantasy hockey at the end of the day, a lot of it is about points and having those top point producers on your team. So I just wondered, Kenny, what is your favorite type of data or statistics to look at? Do you have a couple or one in particular, going into a fantasy hockey season, or, a couple in particular to give advice on and that sort of thing?
Hey guys, there's no betting corner segment in this episode of the podcast, so I thought I would take this time to tell you a little bit about our newest sponsor, BetStamp, the line shopping app for sports bettors. Betting lines have different odds across each sportsbook, and by using the BetStamp app, you can line shop across all of those sportsbooks to ensure that you're finding the best value available on the bets that you'd probably already be making. Also, the BetStamp app allows you to track all of your verified bets across those different sportsbooks so that you can build a more credible record as a bettor, and it allows you to follow other winning BetStamp users so that you can instantly be notified of their picks. So click the link in the description down below to download the BetStamp app today, and when you do, be sure to provide the code BOYSINTHEBOOTH when prompted to do so to let them know that we sent you. Every download really helps us out, and it helps you out as well, so we would really appreciate the support. Thanks, guys.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I do have a couple, but I've combined them all into my data draft player hubs. So I now have the player hub and the goaltending hub, which I didn't have at the draft, but I try to keep it as simple as possible. A lot of times, especially with analytics guys, they get down in the weeds and they're looking at Corsi and expected percentages and all this stuff. And sometimes that does tell you something about a player. But I find that that's more useful for teams that are making decisions on whether or not they need a 6 defenseman that moves the puck or hits or whatever. For fantasy, it comes down to numbers. It comes down to who's producing. And so I keep it simple. Usually for forwards, I'll use goals above and below expected. I'll use the same thing for goaltending. I like to look for goaltending specifically. Little key secret that I use is trying to make sure that your goaltender is on a really top 10 defensive team, because a goaltender like John Gibson is a really, really skilled goalie, but he's getting 38 to 45 shots a game. And if you have volume where you're getting points for saves, that helps, but otherwise he's unownable. And so he's a good goaltender that you'd think he's got the name value value and you're going to pick him and, it'll be fine. And then he ends up getting shelled. He's given up, I think it's 5 goals or more 13 times this year out of like 36 games. So the team defense matters a lot. I just mentioned today that Aiden Hill, as Thompson gets hurt, Aiden Hill is a huge guy to pick up because Vegas is number 2 in expected goals against right now. They're a very solid defensive team. Bruce Cassidy does a really good job, did a good job in Boston, now comes over to Vegas and he's doing the same thing. So I try to keep the data as simple as possible, but then, in I think it was November, December, I combined all the stuff that I look at and put it into the player hub and into the goalie hub. And it just gives you a sense. The player hub is mainly designed for category leagues where you don't have a numerical value that you can compare players with. So I kind of created that value for you, and you can compare players with the comparison tool and whatnot. With goaltending, it factors in goals saved above expected, the team defensive performance, and then the general save percentage, the amount of starts you get, the amount of wins you get. So you can kind of if your league has a point weighting for wins or whatever, you can fade a guy that doesn't get a lot of starts and go for the guy with volume. Or if you're in a different situation in a categories league with save percentage, you can look for guys like that. But I try not to get, I try to bring the data to people without confusing them with it. So that's why I tried to make my own data tool so that people can get the tools that I'm using for the channel so they know exactly how to use it. And then it doesn't get too confusing.
And Kenny, just a quick follow-up to that. How do you feel about the direction of data and where it's going and the use of it as it continues to grow in hockey?
There's a ton. I just saw somebody sent me on LinkedIn game data, and it's you look at the JSON file, which is where you're getting a lot of the raw data, and then you have to then put a table on that or whatever, use it somehow. But it's just massive. They're quantifying every single aspect of the game at this point, and I think the league just this year put in those cameras at the top of the rinks to have they're essentially sensors to get, this is a shot on goal from this point on the ice and whatnot. And it's getting to be a point where there's analytics teams that are growing just to handle that kind of data, not necessarily for hockey decisions, just to be able to manage it, wrangle it, and then, provide that to their hockey people. So it's a lot to work with. And then especially for what I do, it's too much to work with because, not a lot of people have a lot of time for fantasy. So I'm trying to distill even the simple data that I use to something that they can handle on a regular basis. But, in terms of the game, it's growing the fandom. I can see Jay Fresh on Twitter has a ton of people following him and looking at the advanced data and whatnot. People have an appetite for it. But then in terms of the game itself, I think it is changing the game. I watched MSG and Stephen Valaket on there. He's the president CEO of ClearSight Analytics, and some of the insights that he's talking about, like the Royal Road passes, you have a 33% chance of scoring if you go across the slot line once. You have a 60-something% chance if it goes back again. So stuff like that, I think they're starting to implement that with teams and talk to teams and say, look, these are the odds. If you want to play more of an East-West game, this will open up your offense or whatever. I'm a Rangers fan, so I think they do a little too much of that, but nonetheless, it's still it's actionable insights that you can get from data and then use it on the ice, and it's something that we haven't really had until the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we're talking about all of these new innovations in data when it comes to hockey, it's kind of crazy because I would imagine that the teams themselves have way more access to this kind of stuff and have their own internal data teams that we just don't know about. And so I would love to be a fly on the wall in a data room for, say, one of the big teams like Colorado or Toronto or Tampa Bay, a big data team, right? That would be great. I wanted to go back to roster construction here in the draft, in bringing this all back to what we're talking about here, the fantasy draft and managing your fantasy team and becoming a better fantasy hockey manager. So I wanted to bring it back to roster construction and ask you if you had any specific drafting strategies when it comes to drafting your fantasy team. So obviously, I think we've already touched on, for sure, don't pick goalies high. I know another one that people commonly use is taking players at positions where there are less high offense players at that position. What I mean by that is take centers late because there aren't as many wingers available high. So is that something that you do? What are some of your strategies when it comes to the draft?
That was my rule number 3. So I have 4 draft rules. There's probably going to be more as I continue to do it, but just to start with last year, the first one was don't draft a goalie in the first 2 rounds. The second one was you need at least two elite power play quarterback defensemen. And I've gone through this. I've lost John Carlson for the season. I've lost Zach Werenski for the season. Luckily, I stashed Charlie McAvoy because he's pretty much saved everything for me at this point. But if you have injuries, like people are getting into injury trouble right now, there's guys going down left and right. You need to have 2 elite defensemen, mainly to boost your offense because those defensemen are more rare. You're less likely to find those on the wire. I like to highlight, there's guys like Vince Dunn who's kind of come off the wire and he's been very productive. You can find those, but you should treat that as like a D3, not your top 2 elite defensemen. And then, as you just mentioned, the centers over wingers, that was one of the videos I did for strategy. And it basically does come down to the fact that I did an analysis and there's usually like 3.4 to 4.4 right wingers that are putting up a 40 goal pace. And centers, there's a lot more of that. There's like 7 or 8 centers per year that put up that kind of a pace. So even if you're not going to find them on the wire, you're going to find them deeper in the draft. I picked Pasternak in the 3rd round. I don't know how he dropped to me, but like I have McDavid and Pasternak and they're carrying my team. And obviously, you get fortunate with McDavid, but the centers that you can find later, you can pick them up if they're just going to get you assists or power play points or whatever. If that's going to help you out, that works too. You don't have to necessarily have a goal scoring center, but you need those goal scoring wingers because they're very rare. Specifically this year was right wingers, but one thing that I've kind of found is that with the increase in scoring, there are more wingers that are putting up a lot more points. A guy like Carter Verhaeghe is a perfect example. He's, on a career season goal wise. So you can find them, but you should try to bank on getting them in the draft and prioritizing them up front instead of hoping that you're going to find something later on.
Right. And another question, just building off of that, is positional flexibility. How much do you value that? Obviously, if you're between 2 players, one guy is only a center, the other guy is a center right winger, you're going to take the guy who plays 2 positions for maximum flexibility. But just how high do you value positional flexibility in fantasy?
I think it's important for waiver pickups. I think if you're building your roster in the draft, like you want to just take the best player and then try to work out who you can filter in otherwise. It was interesting. I had a conversation with somebody before the draft. They were asking if they should not pick McDavid number 1, if they should pick Draisaitl because of the dual position eligibility. And I had to think about it for a second. I'm like, well, I guess in theory you could use him as a left winger. You could get another center that would maybe, but you can never pick. Like you just should never pick anybody over McDavid number 1. But in general, like I don't look at it too much. In the drafts, if you're deciding between 2 players, it's nice to have a guy who's dual position eligible. A guy like JT Miller is a little bit more valuable because he's 3 position eligible. So that does help you, especially maybe it's only 5 or 10 games max that you're getting more because you can get him in the lineup just based on, using any position that you have. But it's not going to be the be all end all. You want to make sure that you're getting the quality players that are going to put up consistent production for you the whole year, not just a chunk of the season.
Right. So I shouldn't be overly excited then that Travis Konecny just got winger eligibility or center eligibility on top of right wing.
I'm a little excited. I picked him. I got a waiver claim in on him right now because he's ice cold.
Yeah, he is ice cold. And I tried to sell high on him. I had him in both of my leagues. In our Boys in the Booth league, I traded him and a 6th round pick for Victor Hedman and a 12th. So that was a fleece, I believe. Yeah. But now he's ice cold and I couldn't sell him in my other league. So I don't know. I guess I have to hold him, but now at least he has dual eligibility up front. I'm kind of hoping that he turns it around and I can get some more games out of him. But
well, that brings me to the thing I was talking about today and over the weekend. Now's the time where these terrible teams are going to start pissing you off. Like if you're a fan of the Philadelphia Flyers, they're going to start winning games and like getting themselves out of the Bedard sweepstakes. So if you're going to be pissed off about that, you might as well go pick up Konecny to kind of balance it out a little bit so you're not as pissed when that happens. Because now's the time where all these crappy teams, the guys are getting more elevated roles in the top 6 on the power play and whatnot, and they start frustrating you if you're a fan because you want them to tank for Bedard, but they're going to start playing spoiler. So I was like highlighting that today, trying to get people's attention. Guys like Kirby Dach, Konechny's pretty owned up, but some of those guys that are getting an elevated role on a bad team.
Absolutely. And Chad, are we ready to move on to kind of, looking at the trade deadline in terms of fantasy hockey as we get closer to that? Or did you have anything more that you wanted to ask before we jump into that section?
Yeah, I just had one more question before we move on to our trade deadline, because yes, that is something I want to talk about, and how to win week 18, which we're currently in, because I'm in a massive matchup this week against first place in the Boys in the Booth League. So I'm going to have to win this one. But before that, I wanted to ask just, because I'm titling this episode, how to become a better fantasy hockey manager. And we were talking about the Data Draft Player Hub that you created and all of the advanced stats that go into your fantasy decision making. I just wanted to know, where do you pull your data from? Which websites are your go-to and maybe most accessible for people at home who want to get better at fantasy hockey? Aside from your tool that you've built, where does that data come from?
So one of the things that I look for, so I use a couple different sources. In the preseason, I was using mainly RotoWire and Quant Hockey. Quant is really good because you can type in specific dates. So if I'm looking for a player and how they've produced since a coaching change or in the second half or whatever, you can type in the specific dates and look up how that player did over a certain stretch. And that's really helpful for trend videos and trying to, understand how a player plays in certain months or whatever. Like I said, after a coaching change, Brock Besser's been playing a lot better after that coaching change. So Quant Hockey, RotoWire. I still use RotoWire for some things. And then obviously Money Puck. I just don't use Money Puck a ton. I use it mainly for one or two things, the goals above expected, the team goals above expected, things like that. But Money Puck is a really good data source. I also use hockeyreference.com. They give really good split data. So you can find month by month, how the player is producing. You can find how they do at home versus on the road, things like that. And for me, that is starting to come into handy now that I'm playing daily fantasy. Another tool that I use I use it every day is statmuse.com/ask. You can literally just type in, this player versus Minnesota, and they'll give you the stats of that player versus Minnesota. So I use that a lot for daily fantasy. And I try to use that, if a player, has a really good record, like Crosby against the Islanders, you're going to want to have him in your daily fantasy lineup. So that's pretty much how I build my daily fantasy lineup, is seeing how they produce against other teams that they're playing that night. But yeah, so I use StatMuse for that kind of thing. I use Money Puck as one or two elements of both my player hubs, and then it's RotoWire, Quant, a Hockey Reference. Those are the main go-tos that I use.
And now, a word from our sponsors. This podcast is sponsored by Liquid IV. Whether you're staying active or nursing a hangover, Liquid IV has you covered. Just one stick of Liquid IV in 16 ounces of water hydrates faster and more efficiently than water alone. It contains 5 essential vitamins, B3, B5, B6, B12, and vitamin C, with 3 times the electrolytes of traditional sports drinks. It's made with premium ingredients, it's non-GMO, and it's free from gluten, dairy, and soy. There are plenty of awesome flavors, but my personal favorite right now is lemon lime. So get 20% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use the code boys_in_the_booth at checkout. That's 20% off anything in the store when you order using the promo code boys_in_the_booth at liquidiv.com. Experience better hydration today with Liquid IV. This podcast is also sponsored by the best ticket app out there, SeatGeek. SeatGeek takes the confusion out of buying tickets, making it quick and easy to get the best deals on tickets to your favorite sporting events. Plus, Boys in the Booth listeners get $20 off their first ticket purchase on SeatGeek with the promo code BoysInTheBooth in all caps. So click the link in the description down below to download the app, and remember to get your discounted tickets using the code BoysInTheBooth in all caps. Get great seats for a fraction of the cost with SeatGeek.
Awesome. And looking ahead to our trade deadline, I had a couple of questions just kind of based around that. Do you have a player or two in particular who you think could be a really impactful deadline pickup in fantasy hockey this year?
It really depends on, here's what I'll say. It depends on when your fantasy playoffs are. I did a fantasy schedule breakdown video where we kind of went over, there's basically 2 formats that I've seen. Some players have their playoffs week 22 to 24, and mine and a lot of others is 23 to 26, which is the last couple weeks of the playoffs. If your playoff format is week 22 to 24, the Boston Bruins have the most games. So maybe, one of those kind of guys, because Taylor Hall maybe becomes more valuable. DeBrusk is on IR right now. Maybe you could pick him up and stash him for those weeks. If you're in my playoff format and you're looking at week 23 to 26, Carolina, Detroit, and Colorado. And I think Colorado has the most games on off nights during that stretch. And then Carolina, Detroit, Chicago, and Florida, or Nashville, I believe, have the most volume of games during that stretch. So I would look at those teams and see if there's anybody on that team that works best in your format, whether it's a points league or a cats league. If you're looking to add shot volume, if you're looking to add power play goals or whatever, I would just take a look at the teams that are playing the most during your playoffs or down the stretch into your playoffs. And Colorado is one of those teams that's playing a lot now. And on top of that, they weren't very good in the first half, so they have to play really well down the stretch. So if you're asking for one player, I would say, I think he got hurt this morning or he's on IR or whatever, but Pavel Francouz was going to be a guy that I was looking at because if they're playing a lot of games and they have to use their backup, they still have to get into the playoffs, so they're going to be playing meaningful hockey down the stretch, and you're going to probably want him. You're getting excellent team exposure, and they're probably going to give him a ton of run support. So I did end up picking him up this morning at 10, and then I think at 12 he went on, I don't know if it's day-to-day or IR, so I'm a little pissed about that, but that would be one guy I'm looking at. And I have a couple of guys that have asked me about that. I have Lehkonen. If you have an opportunity to grab into Chushkin, those guys are getting power play time with Colorado, and if they have a really good schedule the week of your playoffs, that's going to make a difference.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure you'll make a video for that once the week rolls around, right? And you'll give us a bunch of names, and I'll be cherry picking from that, trying to pick out the best players to pick up.
That was the problem with I did the playoff schedule preview, but I couldn't give any players because it's like the trade deadline has to happen. We're still like 20, 30 games out. So it was sort of just looking at the matchups and trying to figure out the off nights and whatnot. And Colorado was really good for that. So that's why I mentioned them.
Right. And while we're talking about our trade deadline here, I just wanted to ask, because it is kind of far out and you don't know the specifics of every league, are there any candidates right now for players that you would consider buy low candidates in fantasy hockey that, is that still a thing this far into the season? Are there buy low candidates out there for you?
There are players who are typically second half players that I would normally consider a buy low. And the number one guy that comes to mind when I think of that is Kevin Fiala. But you're not really buying low. He's been excellent all year, which I did a whole video on that before the season started. It's crazy. He's basically like a 0.6 point per game guy. And then the second half rolls around and he's like 1.2 points per game and he's on fire. So I did a whole analysis video on the second half based on last year's data. So I would look at some of those guys that were, on that video. Guys like Jack Hughes, Tage Thompson were on that video. Those would be some targets. You're not going to buy low on them because they're obviously having great seasons, but typically some guys start slow. Mika Zibanejad is one of those guys that usually starts slow and picks it up in the second half. And he was, I think it was 2.5 years ago in the bubble, or right before the bubble. He just was on fire going down the stretch and ended up kind of redeeming himself because he started so slow and he ended up a point per game. But if there's a guy like that, now I know a lot of people are asking me about Huberdeau and whether or not he's a buy low, and I just the thing that I keep coming back to is it's just not his year. I've loved Huberdeau. I've had him pretty much every year for the last 3 or 4 years because I usually draft him in the 4th round and he gives me first, second round value. But now this year, you probably drafted him in the 1st or 2nd round and he's terrible. So it's maybe next year's the year to go and grab him. I don't know if this is a buy low year for him, but I would look at guys who typically perform well in the second half, or a team like Colorado, as I just mentioned, they were banged up to start the year. Maybe a guy like Bowen Byram with Makar out. Maybe you look at him as a potential buy low because he's very skilled. He's going to get power play time, and you can kind of take advantage of. He's at 55% right now, so you're still paying a little bit of a price to get him. He may not be available, but those kind of guys with a lot of skill who've been injured in the first half, maybe they come back and light it up. There's another guy I've been getting a lot of questions about is Duclair, because he was really good last year. He's injured right now. You could maybe stash him and try to wait for him to come back. And the only thing I'd say about that is he has the same injury as Max Pacioretty. So the Achilles tendon, and Pacioretty came back. He looked really good for like 6 games and then right back out. And I had him, so I was really pissed about that. So just a warning to anybody out there thinking about Duclair. But those would be some of the things I would look for.
That's really good to know. And, speaking of players coming off injury, I got to tell you, I'm really happy to have Trevor Moore back in my fantasy lineup because he was playing great for the Los Angeles Kings before he went down and had to be put on the IR. So really glad that he's back. And he may be one of my guys that, is kind of a deadline rental that I just had but sat out for a while. So anyway, we'll see how that plays out. But Kenny, I had an interesting question for you when it comes to making trades, because for me, I'm pretty new to fantasy hockey, as Chad and Case and the rest of the guys in our league know, but so I have a tough time making trades and roster moves because I immediately think of it like an NHL GM making a trade between two teams and how that would look and everything. That's the first thing I think of. So just what is that balance, or how important is it to have that balance between a real NHL GM making deals and then a fantasy hockey GM making deals? Just what's your thought on having that balance, and how important is it to have that in mind?
I don't think you should think like an NHL GM. I think that there's 2 things you should pay attention to when you're trying to make a trade. The first thing is your league format and what you're trying to accomplish. Are you if you're in a categories league, if you're light on shots or hits or something, is there a guy that you have that has name value that you can potentially trade to get a guy who's a specialty tool to fill those categories to help your team overall? I like to think of your fantasy team as like a race engine. You've got to put all the parts in place. They have to be functioning properly, well-oiled and everything else to get you across the finish line at the end of the season. So if you're thinking about it like an NHL GM, you're probably missing out on the part of your league that's going to potentially be impacted by your trade. So if you're not looking for, the other thing I kind of just dropped it there is like high name value guys are often more valuable by players who aren't, fantasy managers who aren't that astute and they're not paying attention to a lot of the stuff. So I took advantage early in the year. I had Kubalik, I had Shane Gostisbehere and Spencer Knight, and I parlayed that into UC Saros and Nick Ehlers because Ehlers was on IR, so he was basically a throw-in. And that's one of those things where I had some name value, but also I took guys who were on hot streaks and I kind of parlayed that into a guy who I knew at the time Saros was struggling, but I knew he was one of those guys that gets like 55, 60 starts and he's going to be playing meaningful hockey down the stretch. So typically you can use name value. I have a Patrick Kane on my roster. I'm looking to unload him, hopefully just using name value because it's not really there production wise compared to what he's used to putting up. And then trying to find guys that are hot on the wire and trading them like at the absolute peak, like I did with Kubalik and Gostisbehere and whatnot. And since then, Kubalik has been put back on waivers, so I could just pick him up right now if I wanted to. So that's something that you can do to kind of, manage and kind of game the system a little bit. Also know who you're playing against in your own league. There's certain people that are susceptible. They just like to wheel and deal. They don't like to make moves to like improve their team. They just like to make trades to make a trade. So if you can pinpoint those guys and try to target them early in the season and, before everybody else starts to do that, that's also kind of a good trading strategy. And a couple of guys have picked off this one guy who made that trade for me in the league that I'm in. So that's there's 3 things there. So the name value, selling guys when they're high, and trying to use the league format that you're in to maximize what you're trying to bring back in the trade.
Perfect.
That is so true. Some guys just absolutely love making deals, like Harper in our league. Dylan sends me a deal. I mean, not much anymore because I think we ripped him a bit in the group chat, but he would send me like 2-3 deals a day and they would just be nonsense. Like every single one was an auto reject. But he loved it. He just loved wheeling and dealing. And last year, that's how I got, who did I get? I got Marner and Ekblad for Lindholm and someone else, like Taylor Hall, I think upgrade. Maybe. And yeah, it was, he just wanted to make a move and he hated the Leafs. And that was the year that Marner started off, like he had 2 points through 9 games or something. And I knew Marner was a stud, so had to get him. But while we're talking about, roster construction still and just sort of some players who have been underperforming or overperforming, I wanted to ask you, because we're in a keeper league, the Boys in the Booth keeper league here. And I wanted to ask you then, Kenny, do you have any players in mind who you think would make good keepers? In other words, players who have exceeded expectations based on where they were picked on average.
That's a great question. The obvious guys that come to my mind are, and I'm thinking of this in terms of what they did last year. And if you were in that point last year, you should have picked up a Jack Hughes, a Tage Thompson, guys like that who are breaking out. I guess I've mentioned him twice already, but Carter Verhaeghe, like, he had a really good year last year. When I did a video on the Florida Panthers this year, he was basically tracking with what he did last year. And then since then, he's just like exploded for goal scoring. A guy like Konecny would be another guy who's probably exceeded wherever he went in the draft. Scott Lawton on the Flyers team, he's been pretty good for the same type of reason, but he's kind of cooled off a little bit lately as well. I would look at, especially at this point in the season, those guys that are playing really well on bad teams. A guy like Kirby Dach would come to mind in that instance. Matias Michelli is a rookie out in Arizona, and he's a guy who played well to start, very assist and power play heavy, and then he got hurt, so he kind of fell off, and now he's 2% owned. So if you pick him up now and he turns into, he's a power play specialist and that kind of thing in Arizona, he's going to get the time. I would look at some of those kind of situations, maybe Zegras or Terry, if they're somehow available or gettable in a trade. It's obviously not their year. This would be one of those situations where I would try to get Huberdeau if you're in a keeper league, because his value is not going to be lower than it is right now. And then typically what I've found in terms of actual players getting traded in real life, like this happened to Markstrom not that long ago. The first year they come over, they're not great, and the numbers aren't there, and everybody kind of jumps off the ship. And then the second year, everything clicks. They're comfortable in their surroundings. They're used to their teammates. If it's a goaltender, they're comfortable with the defensive system. So then you can potentially either draft them, deeper in your draft, or if you have an opportunity to grab them at this point in the season when their value is really low, and then try to, just punt the rest of the season and then go for it next year with those guys. That would be a different strategy. The only thing is I'm not the keeper expert. I use my Data Draft Discord group for that because there's a lot of guys playing keeper leagues there. I haven't done it. So I'm kind of just trying to use what advice I've been giving them in terms of what they've been asking for. Is this guy a good keeper or whatnot? But it's a very different format from a redraft league, and you kind of have to plan. If you're in a playoff spot now and you're going for it this year, maybe you can't think about next year. But if you're out of it this year, guys are dumping players for draft picks and things like that. Maybe try to take a stab at Huberdeau or somebody like that, and try to just figure it out for next year.
Yeah, I currently have a waiver claim in on Huberdeau. Don't know if I'm going to get him or not, but it's kind of something I've been thinking about. Maybe he bounces back, not necessarily for a keeper player, but kind of just betting on him coming back. But as you said, maybe it's just not his year. So I don't know. I'm willing to take the gamble.
Are very similar in that sense. I just don't think it's their year, but it's tough for me because people ask me that all the time about Markstrom. I'm like, skill-wise, name-wise, he should be doing better than he is now. The team isn't that bad. They're relatively decent defensively. They're about mid-pack, but there's no real reason why he's struggling so much. It's just probably not his year. And if you're in a keeper league and you notice that Markstrom is struggling, maybe just, pick him up in a, really cheap trade that's not going to cost you a lot and just hold him for next year.
Yeah, another guy is I had Demko in one of my leagues, and I actually traded him for Markstrom. Two goalies who haven't done much. The difference is Markstrom's actually playing, so he's getting a few points at least. But I think Demko's coming back, and who knows what will happen now that they have a new coach. But I think their season is done anyways, whereas Calgary's at least playing for the playoffs, right? So I'm banking on Markstrom being a bit better. So I had to pay I think I pick swapped and downgraded my pick to get Markstrom, but I figured that was worth the bet. But anyways, we're going a bit long here. That's all the questions I had, Harper. Do you have any more to add for Kenny?
I don't think so. I think what I would like, it'd be interesting to get Kenny to take a look at our two fantasy teams and just kind of go through, do a deep dive, what we need, what are our strengths, weaknesses, that sort of thing. That's just the thing that I keep thinking of as our conversation has continued on here. And one more for you, Kenny, before we end this here. You mentioned that you're a New York Rangers fan. You guys are going right now. Obviously, you made the big deal for Vladimir Tarasenko. In terms of data and analytics, How do you feel about that trade for your New York Rangers getting Mikkola and Tarasenko in that deal for the first, the fourth, Sammy Blais, and of course a prospect in Hunter Skinner? So from an NHL fantasy hockey kind of point of view, how do you see that deal for your Rangers?
I think it's tough because I love the deal. Like, I love Tarasenko. I think that's the perfect guy to put on that wing. Kane would obviously have been cool, but he's obviously a little bit hurt, and I think that shied Drury away from going to the Kane route or whatever. Tarasenko has chemistry with Panarin. They've played together at various points in their career. Same draft year. They played in the 2011 World Juniors, and if you remember that game, they were down like 3-1 to Canada, and him, Kuznetsov, and Tarasenko all just like took over the game and came back and won it 5-3. So they've played big games together as well. And I was mentioning that on the channel today, that sometimes the best ad if a guy gets traded isn't the guy himself, because I don't think Tarasenko is going to get a lot of top power play time. They're trying to split up the power play units now and give a little bit more time to the second unit, which they just refused to do for the first chunk of the season. But if they start to get a little bit more of a spread, then that kind of affects everybody else on the Rangers. So I would kind of just look at it as if a guy gets traded like Tarasenko, I would look at some of the other guys to potentially pick it up. You're probably not going to go out there and make a trade for Panarin, although it does happen. But he's been a beneficiary this week, 9 points in 4 games, and that 4-goal game never happens without Tarasenko just like kind of lifting him up. Like, he just doesn't shoot a lot, and then all of a sudden Tarasenko comes over. Now he's got somebody to work with, and it kind of boosts his production a bit. But for me, the thing that's really interesting about the Rangers now is keeping the kid line together, the boys to men line, as they're now being called. But that line has boosted. Hedl has been driving play analytically all year, and then the numbers have started to come since December. And then whenever they put those three together, Lafreniere is basically a point per game guy, and Kakko is close. And I think over the last 7, Lafreniere's got 8 points, and Kakko's right around the same range. So when you get the right line combination like that, that can boost some ownership. Typically, like early in the year, I didn't know who to recommend for the Rangers because Jimmy Vesey was getting top 6 minutes, Goudreau was up in the top 6, and every now and then those guys would be productive. But now, if you see that the kid line's together, I would definitely like pay attention to that line in fantasy specifically, because they drive a lot of play 5-on-5. They're not going to get the power play time, but they're still very productive. But from a Rangers fan's perspective, I think this is really good. Everybody's melting down about Vitaly Kravtsov today in Rangers land, but other than that, everything is really good for being a Rangers fan at this point in the season, and I think that they're built to win a cup at this point. Tarasenko has that cup experience as well, so that definitely helps.
Hey man, can't argue with that. Final Four appearance last year too, and it's clear that Drury and company believe that they've got a shot at it, and I can't disagree with that. Great performance too against Carolina over the weekend as well. So no, your Rangers are looking good for sure. Chad, that's all I had for Kenny. What about you, man?
No, I guess while we're on the Rangers, I'll just add that I think in the preseason, I said that Kravtsov would be back in the KHL by Christmas time. So that wasn't true, and he's been fine. But it's February, and he's asked for a trade, so whatever, that's also fine. Like, I knew he wasn't going to be playing on the Rangers at this point in time, and that seems to be coming true. And also the kid line. Love that line, 100%. I just wish they could find a way to play the two younger players on the line, Kakko and Lafreniere, a bit more in the lineup. That's been my one concern with the Rangers over the last few years. I just feel like they aren't put in a position to succeed as often as they should.
Oh, how much time do we have? I hate how this team like develops prospects. They did it to Elias Anderson. They kept burying him in the AHL. They'd bring him up. They'd play him with Cody McLeod and Brendan Smith, who's playing forward despite being a defenseman. And then they'd wonder why he's got like 5 points in 40 games. And then they do the same exact thing to Kravtsov, dicking him around and then trying to get him, oh, we're going to put you in the minors. Oh, you're going to the KHL. Bring him back. He's played well. Like, eye test, he's very defensively responsible. He's obviously getting knocked off the puck a little bit. But other than that, he's in position all the time. He's generating offense, and then they just don't give him a chance, and they just, keep, I guess it's a chemistry thing, and Gallant maybe this is why Gallant keeps moving on after like a year or two, and he's stubborn. He doesn't give guys opportunities or whatever, but he's found something that works now for the team, and Kravtsov isn't in the lineup, so it's frustrating. But the way that this team develops prospects, I'm constantly defending the way that they've developed Keandre Miller. Philip Heedle's a good success story, but they've had these really big swing and misses, and Anderson was one. Obviously, they've turned that into Will Cooley, who looks a little bit promising as a bigger body, kind of a depth piece, but Vitaly Kravtsov, I was really high on him for a while, and he has the skill level, and he's played playoff hockey in the KHL too, so he could probably be a big game player for you, and they just don't use him right, and it's just frustrating. So I could go on all day about how they develop prospects, but I'll just leave it at that.
It's definitely not all bad when it comes to the Rangers and prospects. I mean, you mentioned Lias Anderson there. It hasn't really worked out for him in the LA organization either. And, if I'm a team like Arizona or Anaheim, Chicago, one of these bottom teams, I am taking a flyer on Vitaly Kravtsov all day long, in my opinion. So
I thought, because my friend was mentioning that David Poile needs to do something to save his job after Eli Tolvanen left. I'm like, why don't you pick up Kravtsov? Like that, there was rumblings about Tanner Jeannot maybe, and I don't know if he's available. But I mean, I don't like that from a growth perspective of trying to develop Jeannot into something that Kravtsov could have been. But for right now, I think that would definitely help. Boost the bottom six, make us a little bit more physically intimidating. Now that we lost Reeves and Sammy Blais, we're kind of light on the hitting aspect of the game, and that could potentially help. But I mean, there's a lot of teams that could use a young 6'3" skilled 22, 23-year-old kid that's about to come into his own. So it's frustrating, but yeah.
And bringing it back to fantasy to wrap it all up here, that's a guy, Tanner Jeannot, who was incredible last year and this year completely unownable. I don't know what happened or what changed, but that's just something. As soon as you mentioned Jeannot, that's what I thought about.
The hits are still there. He's still very ownable if you just need a hits guy, but the goal scoring is not, and that's been frustrating. He does have 2 goals, 2 assists in his last 7 games, so he's starting to find it, but who knows if it'll continue. And everybody in Nashville is down from last year. Duchesne, Forsberg, all those guys, Johansson. I've never really liked owning Johansson or Duchesne or anybody, but last year they were kind of making me pay for not picking them. But the whole team is down, and that's definitely one of the guys that's been affecting. It's chicken or the egg. Is Jeannot the reason they're not scoring, or is the whole team affecting Jeannot's production? It's hard to say.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kenny, thank you so much for doing this, man. You do excellent work. Again, you can follow Kenny on Instagram at data_draft, and you can also check out his YouTube page. He's got some really good content that he posts. Kenny, I have to tell you that, just for prep purposes, I really liked your video on 2021 on the deadline, and just the impact that a change of scenery has on certain guys, and looking at all the deals that went down that year, Anthony Mantha to Washington, and the list goes on. So I thought that was great. So anyway, thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge about data and fantasy hockey, and this was really educational for me personally. So thank you very much, and keep up the great work.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks so much. And also, before we go, where else can we find you? Harper mentioned Instagram and YouTube. What's the link specifically? Like, give us something here, maybe your Patreon.
I'm dabbling in Twitter. I just don't want to commit to Twitter. It's like a sinking ship, but I'm on Twitter at data_draft on Twitter, at data_draft on Instagram, data draft on YouTube. Those are the 3 places that I'm kind of focusing on. But yeah, Twitter is just kind of a crap. It's not the same as it used to be, and it's kind of going downhill. But any of those places, I'm trying to just bust out content every day. I've started to do a lot more short content, so it's just a quick minute. If you have a minute on your phone and you're looking for a short, you get a player sample. I do a fantasy file on a player. I just did Aiden Hill today. just basically looking at what they're trending like, why should you pick this guy up? I featured Harvey Pinard over the weekend. He had an assist after that. He's still going apparently. So those could be nice little tools that you can have just a quick, 1 minute view, and then you have a little bit more info to make some better waiver decisions. But yeah, thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it. I've been watching you guys on Instagram all the time. I like all the grades that you guys were giving out for the different teams and how you pissed off the entire Carolina fan base. That was pretty funny. So it was pretty cool to come on with you guys.
And then you guys beat them over the weekend. So there you go.
I was going to say, I actually had to delete one of the videos there. Some fans were pretty pissed off about some of the content we put out. But I commend you also for the short form content, because let me tell you, that's hard to get out. And I know it's a grind. So I respect you for that, the work ethic. And with all the fantasy stuff, it's great. And 100% one of my favorite follows as of late. So I appreciate it. Thanks again, Kenny.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
This has been another episode of Boys in the Booth with Harper Cody, Chad Melbourne, and Casey Abrams. Connect with the Boys in the Booth on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Boys in the Booth. Visit boysinthebooth.com for show details. And don't forget, you can become a patron of the podcast for just $1 a month at patreon.com/boysinthebooth.